Good morning, everybody. Um, well, this is very brief and, in a way, a side approach of my PhD dissertation that I'm working on, and I hopefully finishing at the beginning of the next year. Um, I'm trying to analyze how music works in film in Chile during the 40s until to the 70s, until to 1973. Um, in this case, I'm going to talk about something in a way different, and this distinction is very interesting because I'm always thinking about music in film. I'm rarely thinking about the composer who wrote that music. I'm thinking about that, but it's not the core of my thesis. So this is a very special exercise for me. So, in this paper, I explore key aspects in the development of film music, the figure of the film music composer in Chile, considering the tension and negotiations between composers and the film production during the first decades of sound cinema, that is roughly 1940s to 1960s. I'd like to provide here three specific examples that can shed light on how film music composition has been understood in the country regarding specific debates surrounding the works of George Andreani, Acario Cotapos, and Gustavo Becerra. I argue that conflicts between popular and academic music milieus, in addition to the hegemony of Hollywood industry and the economic constraints of the national film production, shaped the figure of the film music composer in Chile. In addition, I consider that it's highly relevant that the figure of the film composer has often been hidden, undervalued, and despised by the press and the academia, owing to its position between art and work. I think this is something quite relevant to understand the figure of the composer. So, firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about this last problem, about the invisibilization and the despise to the film music composers. And then I'm going to deal with the specific cases. So, music for cinema has been one of the significant aspects of musical activity in Chile. However, it has remained largely ignored by scholars. We can say that to date, there is there's no big works on film music in Chile. There are some articles that are quite interesting, but it is a field that needs more research. It is possible to interpret this omission as a way to render this work invisible, certainly. For example, the Revista Musical Chilena, the oldest and most influential musicological journal in Chile and Latin America, has almost completely omitted composers' creations in the field of cinema and also theater, highlighting only their work in the classical music field. Some of the articles and reviews in this journal also support an idea that this music has an inferior quality because it has been commissioned, and owing to this, it does not emerge from the pure inspiration. And I say pure because it's certainly is controversial idea. In a similar way, an even more strong criticism we find in one of the most polemical books about Chilean music history that José Manuel talked yesterday, published in 1971 by the composer Roberto Escobar. Here, Músicos sin pasado, musicians without a past, reveals some suspicion about theater and cinema, which Escobar considered as part of the culture industry, and therefore they would belong to an inferior category in relation to the autonomous music. He points out that, I quote, the culture industry includes not only commercial music, that is the whole spectrum of popular music for Escobar, but also other forms of music composed by our art composers, he said, who look for a professional activity inside composition. The most common ways are documentary films prepared for commercial purposes with background music and theater plays with incidental music. So this is quite interesting. He talks about commercial purposes. So what does it mean? And also this idea that the composer is looking for a professional activity inside composition. So his statement, in a way, is saying that composers shouldn't be looking for money or paid work inside composition. And he adds further that undoubtedly some of this music has a good technical quality, very polite of him. However, it has been composed with industrial rather than artistic purposes. The same idea, again, the opposition between work and art. This text was written in 1971, at a moment when several composers were working in fields like cinema, theater, dance, television, etc. And I think that Escobar represents the most conservative segment of the musical milieu of those years. But as we have seen in our conversation here, this was the most powerful segment. So, and it is also interesting that how this conception has remained hegemonic until now. Escobar is emphatic that a composer should not be dependent on financial factors in order to create music, because independence, and I quote, gives a composer an entire freedom from eventual audience. He's not forced to guarantee a financial success because he does not want money for his music. He's putting explicitly. Further, the author notes with dismay that more than half of the young generation of composers, that is Gustavo Becerra, Sergio Ortega, and others, are focused on cinema and theater, and he interprets this data as the commerce's invasion of art. That is the title of my paper today. El comercio va invadiendo el arte in Spanish. What I think is the core of this conflict is the struggle between two opposed ways of understanding the role of the composer during this period, and we can extrapolate to nowadays as well. First, as a composer, as a creator of art music without any external meaning or dependence beyond itself, and the other, the opposed way, the composer as a worker, workers who were able to make music in any field, putting their skills and knowledge in service of the projects they are working on. And this is also related to some extent to the way in which the figure of the composer is understood within society in a broader sense. What's the role of the composer within society? So I think it's time to go to the first case. During the this was left in blank on purpose, so don't be scared. During the late 1930s in Chile, after the arrival of the sound cinema technology, several composers started working in this field. This is a highly relevant moment for film music history for several reasons. One of the main changes that is often overlooked in this period is the fact that prior to sound cinema, the relation between music and film was established on a non-exclusive basis. What is that? Is that you could have a screening with a specific music in Santiago during the silent era, but at the same time, this film could be screened in Valparaíso with a completely different music. So there's no unique relation between music and film. Therefore, the idea of a fixed piece of art did not exist at this time, at least not in the way in which we understand it now. Certainly, there were some attempts to write a specific music for a specific film, especially Chilean filmmakers who were trying to create this idea prior to to sound cinema technology. So they tried to hire a composer to write a score and then copy that score and reproduce around the country. But it was an uncommon practice. But when with the arrival of the sound technology, that became the unique choice. However, at the beginning of the sound era, not many classical composers worked in these films, not surprisingly, and the period was dominated by composers and arrangers that were closer to popular music, such as Fernando Lecaros and Donato Roman, these guys here, who were able to compose non-diegetic or incidental music and at the same time create arrangements on songs for the diegetic sphere, particularly musical numbers that were one of the common strategies at the time. And these musical numbers were often based on popular or folkloric genres. Throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, a large debate on the way in which Chilean cinema should be developed emerged in the cinematic field. The government and a group of filmmakers believed that the only way to develop Chilean cinema was by creating a national film industry with state support. And this is a way to follow the strategies of Mexico and Argentina that were developing very strong industries at the time. As part of the industrialization process led by the Radical Party's government, and this is quite significant because it's part of a project of industrialization of the whole country, and cinema, and by extension music, is part of that process. So, in 1942, Chile Films, a company which was known as the local Hollywood or El Hollywood Criollo, was founded. And its objective was to develop Chilean cinema, to establish a steady level of production and internationalize it. And this is quite connected with the presentation of Juan Carlos, because there is a state project of internationalize local cinema and by extension local music in order to reach international audiences. And this is also a negotiation in terms of what do we need to show abroad, what is the image we want to construct about ourselves to show abroad. One of the measures taken for the development of Chile Films, this company, was to hire Argentinian crew. And this is quite relevant because this country's film industry was a reference for this project. And rapidly, a significant number of directors, actors, technicians, and composers went to Chile to work on its productions. The experience of the Argentinian people was seen as a way to professionalize local cinema because they were seen as more experts. The film industry in the mid-40s in Argentina was quite strong. As part of this group, composer George Andreani arrives to Chile. This guy here. Prior to his arrival, the relation between national composers and filmmaking might be considered as a trial and error approach. I mean that a filmmaker hired a composer and for the next film hired another composer, and there was no constant work for them there. It's difficult to know why, but we can speculate some reasons. Only a couple of composers created a relatively sustained activity in this film, as we saw before, Fernando Lecaros, Donato Roman, and a couple more. Therefore, the fact that Andreani had been hired from abroad, from Argentina, and became the main composer for Chile Films seems quite significant. It's a way to say, nobody is able to do this job here, so we need to bring this guy from abroad to do it, and to do it right. In fact, when he was here, hired by Chile Film in 1946, he had composed music for more than 20 films in Argentina and at least 22 in Czechoslovakia. Andreani was Polish, composer. He was born in Poland, and then he migrated to Czechoslovakia and started working there. And then during the Nazi period, he migrated to Argentina as part of the Jew diaspora. Diaspora or diaspora? You know. So, even during the 2 years that he spent in Chile, he continued working in parallel for Argentinian production. So it's this figure of this guy who works a lot and following the style of Hollywood composers. As a point of comparison, Fernando Lecaros, that was the most prolific Chilean composer in films during those years, had composed music for only 6 films. When Andreani arrived to Chile with 40 films on his background. Chile Films Productions attempt to create a modern aesthetic of national cinema based mainly on international influences such as Hollywood, Argentina, and Mexico. In a detailed examination of Chile Films Production, it is noticeable that the company established the classical Hollywood scoring model as the main reference. The classical Hollywood scoring model was the dominant style of film music commonly associated with the symphonic orchestra, characteristic arrangement, the use of leitmotif, and a series of conventions in the uses and meanings of music within films. The work of Max Steiner and Heinrich Wolfgang Korngold became the main references of this style that rapidly was adopted in other countries and became hegemonic. In this regard, the recruitment of Andreani appears as a strategy to achieve this goal. His style was strongly influenced, as we said before, by Hollywood, and his experience in cinema was something that composers in Chile could not compete with. Andreani wrote music for 7 films in Chile only between 1945 and 1947. That is quite remarkable. And when Chile Film faced an internal crisis that ended with several changes in the company, Andreani came back to Argentina and continued working there. However, some of his techniques were replicated by local composers, so it's a way to say that his influence was continued even when he was not in the country. So, until the late 1950s, the presence of classical composers in cinema could be described as isolated moments in their careers. I mean, local composers. This work was done mainly by popular composers and arrangers, while the world of classical or art music saw this expression with mistrust. It's kind of, we don't want to work there. Classical music had a well-known prestige as an art form, but cinema was usually seen just as an entertainment product. And this changed only during the mid-60s, I think. The few composers that worked in these fields were hired for their musical abilities rather than for their knowledge about film music. Classical composers didn't know the strategies, the techniques, and the goals of film music. So, for example, this is a very interesting case in El Ídolo, a film released in 1952, directed by the French filmmaker Pierre Chenal. The composer Acario Cotapos was hired to compose the score, but he had some problems during the film production. According to Victor Teva, the orchestra conductor who was in charge of the recording, and I quote now, "The film director assigned 60 minutes with music, explained to him each detail of the scenes, and gave him a timetable with the minutes and seconds of music for each one. We never knew where Cotapos could find such a slow chronometer that for the scenes with 2 minutes of music, he wrote 15. The tragedy was that he did not allow any cut. Finally, I had to beg him not to come to the rehearsals so I could make the cuts needed." Apart from being a curious and funny story, this anecdote reveals the extent to which the well-known composer was not familiar with film production. Interestingly, Juan Orrego Salas wrote an article in El Mercurio in which he valued Cotapo's score. And this is one of the few reviews during this whole period. Oh, sorry. During this whole period that is focused completely on music, on film music. In general, music is mentioned only as a secondary aspect in the reviews of the film as a whole. But what is interesting here is that Orrego highlights mostly the qualities of the scores, stating its likelihood to become an autonomous work, and that is quite symptomatic, because this is precisely the objective of film music. Is the contribution to a larger project, not to become an autonomous piece. So it's a way to think that is completely different to the way in which film music composers have to think their own work. So I put here the review in Spanish, but I think we have to move a little bit. However, in the following years, the distance between art composers and film music narrowed to some extent when young composers began to realize that cinema could be a promising space to work not only as composer, but as a musician in a broader sense. And this is something that is relevant as well for theater. We can see that many composers started working in theater prior to work in cinema. They began to work firstly in theater and later in cinema, motivated both by an ideological commitment to the idea of how a composer should be involved with society, and certainly in order to make a living. That is quite important and is quite is in contradiction with the ideas of Escobar. The main figure representing this trend was Gustavo Becerra. Becerra was a multifaceted composer, highly prolific, and he began working in theater in 1947. He wrote music for theater, cinema. He worked in several projects for television and radio, in addition to his role as in education or instruction of other composers. This testimony that I'm going to read soon reveals his particular insight about music and can give us some information about how film music and music in general is understood by Becerra. He said, "Our musicians, especially the last generation, educated at the conservatoire with a high technical and cultural level, with excellent academic training, they work not in concert music, but in the theater, in the cinema, looking for what I think is the future of music, television, cinema, recordings, radio." So this is the completely opposite side to Escobar, and is around the same time. Becerra considered that music could be developed through these platforms, understanding that the future of music, how he described this, would be defined by its dialogue with these other disciplines. And this thought can be clearly traced in the works of other composers such as Luis Advis, Sergio Ortega, among others, who also followed a similar path in terms of their interest for theater and cinema and a different way to engage with society that I think is quite relevant as well. Film and theater music demanded the composer to create music in different styles, genres, instrumentation, beyond their own style or particular preference. In addition, the economic conditions determined to some extent how this music would be made. In some cases, especially for theater, it's always complicated, but for cinema, they faced some constraints in terms of, I don't know, we need to compose music for just one instrument because we don't have more budget or etc. So they were forced to balance creativity, demands of the play of film, and economic constraints. In addition, these works posed a question, at least for some of the composers, in terms of how they related with broader society. Besides, work as film or theater musicians offer the chance to work as composers instead of taking another job. And this is quite interesting if we think in the other approach, that is defending composition to be part of, to be considered as a job. In addition, I think that their connection, particularly in the case of these three composers, their connection to film and theater music contributed to shaping an aesthetic that is linked to popular and folkloric genres. The demands of film and theater could be highly diverse, as we mentioned before, and they needed to know different styles, genres, and techniques. And I think it's not a coincidence that later they became highly involved in popular music. So, beyond the specific cases, I think that these conflicts illustrate two approaches to music that differ radically. On the one hand, an idea of the autonomy and genius in which the history of art and music in particular has been built in Chile, and on the other, the music understood as a form of work, and composition particularly understood as a work that had been generally neglected. The study of film music in Chile reveals insightful ideas in order to understand the history of music composition in a broader sense as well. Film music has been a significant part of the composer's trajectory. However, even with these groundbreaking composers, and to some extent outsiders, as José Manuel mentioned yesterday, figures like Becerra, Ortega, or Advis, frequently we continued reproducing the same discourses related to romanticism, the ideal of the artist that is completely isolated of the world and its constraints. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And now, as always, we are open for some questions. I will begin then. Maybe you can think about something. Do you think that, personally, do you think that art and work can be together? Should be together or cannot be together?
I think it's not a thing of what I think or what I don't think. I think music and work has been together since, I don't know when, but we can trace in the music history, and there's a whole history of musicians as workers, and this is something we cannot deny. We can trace in the, even in the cases of some of the most famous composers. I'm thinking on Bach, for example, or Mozart. We know some stories about how they had to deal with the idea of music as a job, composition as something that you get money for that, as well as we can trace this idea in the history of art in a general sense, especially in painting or in different in different arts. It's very interesting that there are a lot of research on Shakespeare and how he was commissioned. He was asked to write some theater plays, and the way in which he dealt with these commissions in order to earn a living and to create his works. So I think, I'm just saying what is been working in music history.
Yeah, so in that sense, there wouldn't be a difference between composers who are working to make a piece just for themselves, to keep it at their home and not even have it played, and composers who are writing from one day to another to have some music played in a film in Hollywood, for example. It would be both things are work.
Yeah, but we're talking about work in the sense of a job. In this case, in the case of film music,
in exchange for money.
In exchange for money. If you wrote music for yourself, nobody is going to
exactly.
realize that you work it. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe there we would have a difference, because there are a lot of composers I know. They, of course, everyone wants their pieces to be played, but a lot of them do not find that as the main goal of what they are doing. Some of them just want to relate through writing and express themselves.
Yeah.
And maybe we could have a problem there to call this a work. I don't know if somebody in the audience is.
I'm not trying to call every composition as a work or as a job. Certainly, if you are not paid for that and your objective is not that, I'm not trying to say that something is better than other thing. I'm just trying to show that film music composition, that is a quite significant part of the Chilean music composition in the broader sense, is highly relevant to understand film, to understand music composition, its development in Chile. The figure of Becerra, the figure of Ortega, and the figure of these other composers has emerged during these talks a lot, and it's interesting that we continue thinking about them mainly as composers who also wrote for cinema or also wrote for theater. I think the case of Luis Advis is quite significant. And Jose Manuel mentioned yesterday, Luis Advis composed music for 100 theater plays. And probably in his spare time, he wrote the Cantata Santa Maria and some wind quintets. But he's mainly a theater music composer.
Yeah, there we have a very interesting this potential for discussion. I mean, because as you said, something is quantity, and other thing is quality. And I'm not saying here that what he wrote for film is less had less quality or so. But excuse me. But today, Luis Advis is mostly remembered, for example, for the cantata.
Yeah.
Why is that? I think it has something to do with our society, how we, as you said also, we tend to look down to this other music, this music who that is written, at least written with this other purpose in mind.
Yeah, I think the cantata is obviously a wonderful composition, and it's quite interesting that the cantata had the relevance that it had during the 70s. Maybe I'm not the most the best person to talk about this. Eileen has wrote a full dissertation on this topic. Maybe we can ask to her. But I'm not trying to put quantity over quality. I'm just trying to say that the way in which we think music composition or the life of composers should be useful to think about this in different ways. I'm not saying that we have to value only theater works of Advis and forget the cantata. It's not as radical as that. It's just a way to think differently and try to pose this question: why this is relevant? Why the cantata is that popular, and we are never considering these side jobs? That what I want to say with the quantity is that it's not really a side job.
It was the main job,
yeah.
Actually. No?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it has a lot to do with how these pieces were marked.
Yeah,
marked
probably.
Please, there's a microphone there. Eileen, maybe can you? Thank you.
Hello? It is? Yes. No, I just want to add that... No? Sorry. No, it's okay. Okay, sorry. I just want to ask putting together both comments, that, yes, one thing is the work of, in understanding the work as a paid job, or but also we can understand that as a maybe not a paid work, but understanding the strategies that the composer does while writing or while creating, following some other constraints. For example, this example of the duration of the music, if it can be 2 minutes or 15 minutes, or just in the case of Advis with the cantata, yes, maybe it's one of the most famous works of him, but his decisions of writing every single part of the work were just artistic, or were also other decisions as how, for example, I don't know, how to visualize some other historical events in his work, how to put the rhythm or the words, you know, like other decisions that are not necessarily artistic, or maybe they are artistic, but they are not just this kind of spontaneous expression of the soul, but are other kind of decisions. And also I would like to add to your question, in this sense, what this comparison of quality and quantity with, for example, the work of Advis, why we know more about the cantata than the other music that he wrote for cinema or theater, and also why he never get this super prize of musical composition.
Yeah.
That's a question.
I just want to mention that I'm thinking in the case of Becerra that it's quite symbolic, because he had a very key role in the education or the training of other composers, and in a way he was creating a different trend or different path. I talked with Pedro Chaskel, one of the most well-known filmmakers, that was the director of the Center for Experimental Cinema, in which Becerra wrote a lot of his film music, and he told me we never talk about money, because we were paid by the university. We had our post at the university. So in the case of the Center for Experimental Cinema, that is a very specific case, he didn't receive any particular payment, but Becerra worked as well in industrial films, that this kind of commission film that by an industry, but the copper mines or whatever, and he was paid for that money. And I mean, I'm not saying that this is a completely strict distinction. We can see in this specific case that a composer is receiving money in some cases and not receiving money in other. But it's the way in which he thought about the work he was done.
Yeah.
He was doing, yeah.
Carlos?
Yeah, 2 comments. The first one is about this topic, I mean earning money, being a composer. We have to consider that when the official musical life in Chile was created at the beginning of the 20th century by the hand of Gustavo Santa Cruz, most composers studied music in addition to another main career. Juan Amenábar was an engineer. He built some big projects in Chile, being a composer as well. Even Luis Advis was a lawyer. Juan Rojas Segers is a doctor. Leng was a dentist. And the list is quite big. So I believe, they thought that being a musician, being a composer was a kind of hobby, something like that.
Yeah.
and this thinking way remain to our days. In the case of the Cantata Santa Maria, this cantata became a symbol of the working rights, the workers' rights, but not because the music, but because the lyrics, because the text.
But are you sure about
No,
that?
yeah, I love this music. I love it. I have played many times, and even now I hear this music once a month. But the audience, not the musicians, not people who know about music, the general audience became fan and took this music because the lyrics.
I think we can say
I make the
that.
point.
Yeah, yeah. But if we follow that idea, we could say that music doesn't matter in a film because there are no words. But probably we can trace, and part of my job here is try to in my dissertation, I mean, is try to find the ways in which music is delivering meaning or contents beyond the words. So I think it's quite it's valid, but we can. I think it's difficult to say that this separation between lyrics and music can be done, especially in a work like the cantata. We can discuss more with wine or something because it needs to be dissolved.
I have one last question,
Yeah.
and it's about what is the place that this film music or the study of film music or composers for of film music. What is the place that this has had in the academy in Chile? Because as we have heard a few times already, it's very important for how these categories are used and what is valued and what is not valued or what is more valued. And so the academy has a huge role to play.
Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit about what is the place of film music there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think musicologists or in maybe music scholars in a wider approach during the past had been ignored completely or almost completely film music, and that is quite symptomatic. We were talking about before about the idea of what's the role of the musicologist as well, and it's quite significant that most of the work done by musicologists and music scholars has been focused on other aspects, especially in this idea of Escobar about the art as autonomous work and the idea of the artist instead of these approaches. So I think musicologists have a depth with these other kinds of approaches to music. I think musicology in Chile has more lacks than goals at the time because it's a growing field. But I think it's very interesting that the focus has been, in a way, in the way I mentioned here, is quite conservative. It's following the same strategy as the discourse of romanticism, the romantic approach towards music history. So I think the work by Juan Carlos, some of the works of José Manuel, some of the work of other musicologists we are trying to change these approaches and to bring different perspectives to understand the wide scene. And it's also symbolic that some of the few works in this field in Chile in film music had been done from the perspective of popular music. So we can find some mentions to film music in the works by Juan Pablo González, or in students of Juan Pablo González who are studying popular music, because they even when Becerra or these other composers are not considered as popular music, but these guys are seeing, they are finding that this distinction, as you asked to Juan Carlos, is not easy to put the boundary.
Yeah.
So maybe it's need to avoid the boundary at least for a moment to understand a wider approach. You know? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martin.
No?
Do you have a question? It's okay. I think we have the time. Yep.
You know, just wanted to say, I think this is a really interesting discussion. I hope it comes more during the day, because at the end there are many layers to it. Like obviously this still sort of late 19th century, sort of Brendel discussion of the goal of art is, and the goal of the art of music should be freedom and being free from other constraints and all of this project, and how that comes into a Latin American side of things, which is I think very different. And at the end, what you say, thing is about this being a scene for the 20th century. The musical composition scene is one of upper middle class or really upper class male composers that have a secondary job, and so they're really able to think of music as sort of something they can do as a free thing, that escapes the world and everything and their constraints, because they don't have constraints, economic ones. And then Luis Advis, you ask why the cantata, and I think even until his very last years he didn't think of the cantata as some sort of big music work in that sense. He was thinking of it more as a sort of alongside his theatrical music, popular music, and film music. Only in the very last time he heard it perform, he was saying, okay, this is good music, I have to admit it. But in all the previous interviews, he was always saying, no, this is all my cheap thing. It's not my classical music, which is the one I hope people consider. And then he was always talking about his quintets and about that single little piece for a wind flute quartet, I think it is, which is the only thing they use always in these canonical, compilations, even in the last one from Juan Pablo González and Rafael Díaz. So it's always, canonically, they try to bring Advis into this, and he wanted that for some time. And only in the late 90s, and just before he died, he was thinking, okay, like maybe really I am not that composer, and maybe I should appreciate what I've done. And interviewing Silvio Cayosi, with whom he worked in 2-3 films.
3 films.
That Cayosi told me that in the very last meeting they had, the very last meetings for Coronación, 3 years before Advis died, Advis had to compose. They had to use a cumbia for the film, and Advis had to. At the end, he said, "Okay, I'm going to write the cumbia like myself." And it was the most difficult thing for him to do for the entire film, but he took it as if it were a composition. Like he really tried to make a composed cumbia, which really is a cumbia. It's not. So he really, I think he was dealing with that issue at the very very end of his career, but because it was at the very end and really in the 21st century, just before he died. So I think the constraints are there, and the discussion, he was conscious of that. And he didn't come from that Santiago upper middle class too. So I think that is also very important.
I think that this is an experience that a lot of composers have, because you begin studying and then your brain is washed somehow. And then you continue to study with maybe abroad or with other professors, other composers, and you are always searching for an identity. And I think I understand completely what you said about Advis, that maybe at the end of his life he will realize what kind of composer he really was, or what was his true soul. And that is a never-ending process, I think. Would you like to add something? Or?
No. We
Okay.
can go to the coffee and talk more.
We are going
freely.
to watch a short film first,
good. Sorry.
and then we're going to go to the coffee break. So thank you once again.